Ever get that feeling like something's just not right? Maybe you see an elderly neighbor and their mail's piling up, or a relative with a disability, and their caregiver just seems off, impatient.
Yeah, that sense of, hmm, should I be worried? It can be tough, right?
Hmm.
Trying to figure out if something's really wrong, if you should do something, especially when it comes to the well-being of elders and dependent adults.
Absolutely. And it feels like there's this whole web of rules and regulations around it, making it even more confusing. Like, what are our actual responsibilities here?
Right. Who are we even obligated to protect? It's not always clear.
So that's exactly why we're doing this deep dive today. We're going to try to untangle all of that, specifically focusing on the legal side of things. When are you actually required to report abuse of elders and dependent adults here in California?
We're basically giving you the tools to not only understand the rules, but to actually feel empowered to step in and protect someone if needed.
Exactly. And to do that, we're diving deep into this document, Elder and Dependent Adult Abuse Reporting.
It lays out the whole Elder Abuse and Dependent Adult Civil Protection Act, which is kind of the backbone of all this. You can find it in the Welfare and Institutions Code, sections 15600 to 15675, if you want to get really specific. But don't worry, we'll break it down.
Perfect. So let's start with the basics. When we say elder and dependent adult, who exactly are we talking about in the eyes of California law?
Elder is pretty straightforward. Anyone living in California, 60 years or older, boom, they're considered an elder.
Okay, that makes sense. But dependent adult sounds a bit more, I don't know, nuanced.
Yeah, you're right. It's a little more specific. So it refers to someone between 18 and 59 also living in California, but here's the key. They have to have some kind of physical or mental limitation, something that makes it hard for them to do everyday things or even protect their own rights.
Got it. So, like, what kind of limitations are we talking about?
They give some helpful examples in the document. Could be a physical disability, a developmental disability, or even just age-related decline, even if they're not 60 yet.
Oh, okay. So it doesn't have to be a super severe disability or anything?
Nope. And another important one, anyone who's an inpatient in a 24-hour health facility, so like a nursing home or hospital.
Interesting. So it really covers a wide range of folks. Makes sense, though, right? To protect those who might be more vulnerable.
Exactly. It's all about safeguarding those who might need extra support.
Okay. So now that we know who we're talking about, let's get into the tougher stuff.
Hmm.
What actually counts as reportable abuse?
Okay, so this is where we get into mandated reporters.
Like specific people who have to report abuse if they see it.
Exactly. Certain professionals, just because of their jobs, are legally required to report certain types of abuse. And it doesn't matter if they see it themselves, they know about it, or even if the elder or dependent adult just tells them about it.
So it's like a legal obligation because of their professional role.
You got it. And this document, it breaks down the different types of abuse that trigger this mandatory reporting. First up, we've got physical abuse, which, I mean, it's pretty much what it sounds like, right? Using force against someone.
Right, but are there specifics? Like what exactly falls under physical abuse in the eyes of the law?
Oh, yeah, they get super specific. We're talking assault, battery, assault with a deadly weapon, basically anything that could cause a serious injury. And it goes beyond just hitting or punching.
Oh, wow. So it's a pretty broad category.
It is. They also include unreasonable physical restraint, like tying someone up or something, and even like withholding food or water for a long time.
It's crazy to think that happens, but I guess it does.
Unfortunately, yeah. And here's another big one. Sexual assault is also under physical abuse.
Okay, that makes sense.
And the law is very clear on what that includes. Rape, spousal rape, incest, sodomy, oral copulation, sexual penetration, and lewd or lascivious acts, all very specifically spelled out.
So no room for interpretation there.
Not at all. And then there's misuse of restraints or medications.
Like physical restraints or like drugging someone?
Both, actually. If
Yeah.
someone's using physical restraints or psychotropic meds as punishment, or giving them more than a doctor prescribed, or using them for something they're not meant for, that's all considered abuse too.
So even if a doctor prescribes a medication, but it's being misused, that's still reportable.
Exactly. It's all about intent and appropriate use.
Got it. Wow, so physical abuse covers a lot of ground. What's the next category?
Okay, so next up we've got abandonment, which basically means someone who's supposed to be taking care of an elder or dependent adult just ditches them.
So just leaving someone helpless and on their own?
Pretty much. If you're responsible for their care and you just walk away in a situation where any reasonable person would stick around, that's considered abandonment.
Wow. Okay, so that's pretty clear cut. What else is on this list?
Next is abduction.
Like kidnapping.
Kind of, but it can be more than that. It includes taking someone out of California against their will, or keeping them from coming back if they can't consent for themselves. Or, if they can consent but someone does it anyway without getting permission from their conservator or the court.
So it's about controlling their movements, their freedom.
Exactly. Taking away their choices, their autonomy.
Okay, what's next?
All right, now we've got isolation. This one's all about intentionally keeping an elder or dependent adult from connecting with the outside world.
So like what? Not letting them answer the phone or something?
Yeah, like that. Preventing them from getting their mail, telling people they're not available when they actually are, keeping them locked up, even physically restraining them so people can't visit. Basically anything that cuts them off from others.
That's awful. And it can be so insidious, right? Like slowly cutting someone off until they're completely isolated.
Exactly. It can be a really subtle form of abuse.
So no phone calls, no visits, no mail. Is there anything else that falls under isolation?
Well, there's a note here about an exception. It says, these actions don't count as isolation if a doctor specifically orders them, like maybe for medical reasons, or if it's to protect someone from immediate danger. Like there's a real threat to their safety.
Okay, so there are situations where it's justified.
Right. It's not always black and white. It depends on the context.
Got it. What's the next category?
All right, next we have financial abuse. And this is basically when someone takes advantage of an elder or dependent adult for financial gain.
Oh, like stealing your money?
That's one way. But it can be sneakier than that, like hiding their assets, using their money without their permission, even tricking them into signing documents that benefit the abuser.
So any kind of shady financial dealings, basically.
Yep. If someone's using their position of power or trust to take advantage of an elder or dependent adult financially, that's abuse.
Makes sense. Unfortunately, that's something we hear about way too often. Okay, what's the last one?
Last but not least, we have neglect.
Now, neglect seems like it could be a lot of different things. What exactly does it mean in this context?
You're right. It's a broad category. Basically, it means someone who's supposed to be caring for an elder or dependent adult isn't doing their job properly. They're failing to meet the person's basic needs.
Like not feeding them or something?
Yeah, like that. But it can also be things like not helping them with hygiene, not providing adequate clothing or shelter, or failing to get them the medical or mental health care they need.
So it can be intentional, but it can also just be negligence.
Exactly. It's not always about deliberately harming someone. It can be about failing to do what's necessary to keep them safe and healthy.
Okay, so it's about both what you do and what you don't do.
Precisely. And there's one more important piece to neglect. It also includes self-neglect.
What does that mean? Like if someone isn't taking care of themselves?
Exactly. So even if there's no caregiver involved, if an elder or dependent adult can't properly care for themselves because of dementia, mental limitations, substance abuse, or chronic illness, that can also be considered neglect.
So it's not just about someone else neglecting them, it's about the potential for harm because they can't care for themselves, regardless of why.
Exactly.
Okay,
Yeah.
so we've covered all the types of abuse that mandated reporters have to report. But what about other types of abuse? Like what if you see something that's not on that list, but you're still concerned?
That's a great question. And the law is pretty clear on this, too. If you know about or suspect any other type of abuse, even if it's not on that mandatory list, you're still encouraged to report it. Or if you just have a bad feeling about someone's emotional well-being.
So even if you're not legally required to, it's still the right thing to do if you're worried.
Exactly. It's all about prioritizing the safety and well-being of vulnerable individuals.
Okay, so let's say someone witnesses or suspects abuse. What's the next step? When and how should they actually report it?
The law is pretty firm on the timing. If you're a mandated reporter, you got to report it immediately or as soon as you possibly can.
So no waiting around.
Nope. And you've got two options. You can call it in or use the online reporting tool. They have this confidential internet reporting system set up, which is great.
Okay, that makes sense. Speed is key in these situations. And what if you call it in first? Is that it?
Well, if you do an initial report over the phone, you still have to submit a written report or fill out the online form within 2 working days.
So it's like a double confirmation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It ensures there's a clear record, for follow-up and everything.
Right, makes sense. Now, earlier you mentioned an exception for mandated reporters when they're told about abuse. Can you remind me about that? When would a report not be required?
Okay, so this is very specific. A mandated reporter doesn't have to file a report only if all three of these things are true. First, they don't have any evidence to back up what they're being told. Like, there's nothing else to suggest abuse actually happened.
Okay, so no corroborating evidence. What's the second condition?
Second, the person reporting the abuse, they have to have a diagnosis of dementia or some other serious mental illness, or they're under a conservatorship because of that.
So their ability to accurately report might be compromised.
Exactly. And third, the mandated reporter, based on their professional judgment, they have to believe that abuse didn't actually happen. So it's like their clinical expertise tells them something else is going on.
So it's a pretty narrow exception, really. It has to be all three of those things.
Exactly. It's a tricky situation, but they're trying to balance the duty to report with the fact that sometimes people with cognitive impairments might not be reliable narrators.
Right. You don't want to dismiss someone's claims, but you also have to consider the context. And what about that point about psychologists and partner abuse?
Oh, yeah, that's another important one. So for psychologists who are acting as therapists, they only have to report partner abuse if the person being abused is an elder, a dependent adult, or a minor.
So it depends on the age of the victim, essentially.
Right. If they're in one of those categories, then it falls under elder abuse, dependent adult abuse, or child abuse, and the psychologist is required to report it.
Got it. That makes sense. So once a report is made, who actually receives it? Like which agency?
That depends on a couple of things. Mainly where the abuse supposedly happened and what type of abuse it is.
Oh, okay. So it's not just one central place.
Nope. The document actually refers to this Table 3, which we don't have here, but it lays out all the different agencies that handle these reports. It could be Adult Protective Services, the police, maybe even the ombudsman for a long-term care facility if that's where it happened. It really varies.
So it's important to know that it might get routed to different places depending on the situation.
Exactly. But the key is to make that initial report. The receiving agency will usually figure out where it needs to go from there.
Got it. Okay, so let's talk confidentiality. When someone makes a report, is that information kept private?
For the most part, yes. These reports and all the info in them are confidential under the law, but there are some exceptions, like certain people or agencies that are allowed to see it.
Okay, so who are these exceptions?
Well, they refer to specific people and agencies in the Welfare and Institutions Code, Section 15633.5, if you want to look it up. But one important thing they mention is these multidisciplinary teams.
What are those?
They're basically teams of professionals from different fields who work together to prevent, identify, and treat elder and dependent adult abuse. It could be social workers, doctors, police officers, lawyers. They all come together to get a better understanding of the situation and figure out the best way to help.
So it's like a collaborative approach.
Exactly. It's about bringing different perspectives to the table and coming up with a coordinated response.
That makes a lot of sense. But what about confidentiality within those teams? Like if they're sharing sensitive information, is that still protected?
Oh, absolutely. The law is really clear on that. Anyone on these teams or any agency that gets info from a report, they're all bound by the same confidentiality rules as the person who made the initial report.
So it's like a chain of confidentiality.
Yep. And there are serious penalties if they break those rules. It's all about protecting the privacy and rights of the individuals involved.
Okay, that's good to know. Now, what about legal protection for the people who are actually making the reports? Like, if they report something and it turns out to be wrong, could they get sued or something?
Good question. And the answer is generally no. If you're a mandated reporter and you file a report, you're basically immune from lawsuits. You can't be held liable, even if it turns out you were mistaken.
That makes sense. It takes a lot of pressure off the reporter.
Right. It encourages people to report, even if they're not 100% sure, as long as they have a reasonable suspicion.
So better safe than sorry. And what about people who aren't mandated reporters, like just regular folks who see something concerning?
They're protected too. As long as they're acting in good faith, they can't be held liable either, unless they knowingly filed a false report.
Okay, so there are protections in place to encourage people to speak up. But what about the flip side? What if someone knows about abuse and doesn't report it? Like, if they're a mandated reporter and they just ignore it, what happens then?
Well, that's where the law gets pretty serious. Failing to report when you're required to, or doing anything to prevent someone else from reporting, that's a misdemeanor.
Whoa, a misdemeanor. So like jail time?
Potentially. You could get up to 6 months in jail, a fine of up to $1,000, or both.
That's huge. They're not messing around.
Nope. And it gets even worse if the failure to report leads to something really bad happening.
Like, what do you mean?
Well, if someone doesn't report abuse, and the elder or dependent adult ends up dying or getting seriously hurt because of it, the penalties go way up.
So if their inaction directly leads to harm.
Exactly. In that case, they could be looking at up to a year in jail and a $5,000 fine.
Wow. That really highlights how important this is. It's not just paperwork, it's about protecting people's lives.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, I think we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about who's protected under California law, what counts as abuse, when and how to report it, who gets those reports, all the confidentiality stuff, and the legal consequences for reporting and not reporting.
We've pretty much dissected this whole document, yeah.
So for you, our listeners, just to recap the key points, you need to know the definitions of elder and dependent adult. Make sure you understand the main types of abuse that you're required to report if you're a mandated reporter. That's physical abuse, abandonment, abduction, isolation, financial abuse, and neglect. And remember, report immediately if you see something, know something, or are told something.
And don't forget, there are laws that protect you if you report in good faith.
Exactly. But there are also serious consequences if you don't report when you're supposed to. We really hope this deep dive has given you a better understanding of all this so you can feel confident about what to do if you ever encounter a situation like this.
You know, taking a step back, all these regulations, they give us a roadmap. They help us recognize potential red flags and understand how we can step in, whether we're legally required to or not. It's about moving beyond that feeling of should I be worried and knowing what concrete steps we can take.
I like that. It's like giving you the knowledge to act. And maybe even prompting you to pay closer attention to things you might have brushed off before, like if your elderly neighbor suddenly seems withdrawn or a relative's finances are a mess, maybe that's a sign that something's wrong.
Exactly. Trust your instincts and know that there are laws in place to support you if you need to speak up.
It really does make you think. Okay, so we've talked about legal obligations, but what about going beyond that? Like, how do we as a community create a culture where elders and dependent adults are truly safe and respected, where abuse is just not tolerated?
That's a really important question. It's about awareness. It's about looking out for each other.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
And until next time, take care.